Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into the fascinating world of what makes us tick. Specifically how our attitudes form, why we behave the way we do, and also the powerful, often invisible forces of social influence and persuasion that constantly shape our decisions. This deep dive is really designed to give you a shortcut, a way to get truly well-informed on these critical concepts. We're drawing from a stack of insightful sources, academic research, but also compelling real-world examples. Our mission, well, it's to unlock some profound insights, maybe give you a few aha moments along the way, and ultimately equip you to better understand yourself and, the world around you. So let's start with what seems like a pretty simple connection: attitude and behavior. The ideal scenario, the one we all sort of intuitively hope for, is that a positive attitude leads directly to positive behavior. You believe in healthy eating, so you eat healthy. Straightforward, right? But here's where it gets really interesting and often, counterintuitive. Sometimes, even a deeply held kind of healthy attitude can ironically lead to harmful behavior. Think about someone who holds incredibly positive attitudes towards, say, the sanctity of marriage. And because of that very attitude, they might remain in an abusive, potentially deadly domestic situation. That's a really stark, painful disconnect, isn't it?
It truly is a really difficult situation. And our sources suggest that understanding these inconsistencies, between what we believe and what we actually do, that's the first step towards changing behavior. When we talk about shifting attitudes or behavior, there are a couple of, powerful approaches mentioned. First, there's cognitive therapy. At its core, it's about identifying and changing irrational ways of thinking. This is the fundamental premise behind so much of what we see: daily advertising, political campaigns, even public health messages. They're all trying to alter our thoughts, hoping that new thoughts lead to new attitudes, which then, ideally, lead to new behaviors. Then there's cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. That aims more directly to correct inappropriate behavior. It's built on ideas like those from George Kelly, who suggested that each of us views the world through unique constructs. You could think of them as our personal mental maps or lenses. And these maps aren't fixed, they change as we experience new things. And what's fascinating is that while for adults, behavior often springs from our attitudes, for children, it's often the other way around. Their attitudes are frequently shaped by the behaviors they see, the behaviors they observe around them.
Yeah, that makes so much sense when you watch kids learn and, mimic people. But speaking of changing attitudes of behavior in an instant, I love this example from the Olympics. Imagine Alex, a triathlete, running second, 14 seconds behind the leader, feeling the race slipping away. He's on the brink of defeat. Then his training partner, Alistair Brownlee, shouts from the sidelines, "Anything can happen, mate." And in that split second, something just shifts in Alex's mind. He digs deep, overtakes the leader, and wins gold. It's an incredible illustration of how a quick shift in attitude can instantly, dramatically change behavior.
It really is. And what's truly fascinating here is understanding when attitudes are actually good predictors of behavior, because it's not always a straightforward link. For spontaneous, sort of on-the-spot behaviors, our attitudes only really predict them if they're highly accessible, which means, how quickly and effortlessly that feeling or belief comes to your mind. If your attitude isn't readily available right there, then other factors like the immediate situation or social pressures often take over. They become more influential. However, for more planned behaviors like deciding whether to vote or maybe pursue a specific career path, our sources highlight the theory of planned behavior. Think of it like this. Planning a big trip. You're likely to go if you want to go, right? That's your attitude toward the act itself. And if your friends are going and kind of expect you to be there, that's the subjective norms. And crucially, if you feel like you can actually afford it and get the time off work, that's your perceived control over the behavior. This theory helps us understand everything from why people vote the way they do to how deeply ingrained patriarchal attitudes, unfortunately, can limit opportunities or even contribute to things like domestic violence.
Right. And this brings us to a real paradox, doesn't it? It feels like one. Why do we often have incredibly positive attitudes, say, towards good health, but then fail to act on them, like not exercising consistently? We all know that feeling. Or, on a bigger scale, why do nations publicly support a cause? Like the example given, USA and Russia supporting India's bid for a UN Security Council seat. But then their actions, like not favoring Security Council reforms, seem to contradict that stated support. There's often a clear disconnect between the words and the deeds, on both a personal and global scale.
Exactly. It's a common theme. Our sources suggest that to bridge this gap, to try and increase the correlation between our attitudes and our actions, we need to cultivate things like emotional intelligence, practice introspection to really identify our own attitudes, not just what we think we should believe, and connect with our conscience maybe to understand the deeper reasons behind our beliefs and behaviors.
Okay. And speaking of those internal battles, that discomfort, let's explore what happens when our thoughts and actions just don't align. When they clash, creating that profound mental unease. This is what the sources call cognitive dissonance.
Right. Cognitive dissonance theory explains this very mental discomfort or dissonance we feel when new information or a situation directly contradicts our existing beliefs, attitudes, or values. This isn't just a fleeting annoyance. It's a powerful internal drive. That discomfort motivates us, sometimes quite intensely, to change something, either our belief, our attitude, or our behavior to reduce that dissonance. Humans seem to have this fundamental tendency to seek consistency among our thoughts. We like things to line up. So if there's dissonance, something has to give, has to change.
It's truly like a mental itch you just have to scratch, isn't it? Imagine you're recruiting someone. They're professionally brilliant, highly competent, but then you discover they're ethically questionable. That creates immediate cognitive dissonance, that clash. So how do you resolve it? Well, you might change your behavior and simply not hire them. Or you might eliminate the dissonance by deciding, well, their ethics don't really matter as long as they perform well. This aligns your thoughts and behavior, even if it's, maybe a problematic alignment. What's truly fascinating is how this fundamental human need for consistency can sometimes lead us to rationalize deeply unethical choices, simply to avoid that mental discomfort. Our brains will often find the path of least resistance to peace, even if that path isn't the most virtuous.
Absolutely. And you see this play out in administrative contexts as well. It's not just personal. If a department's stated mission promotes ethical behavior, but its leaders are consistently engaging in unethical practices, employees will feel that dissonance. They see the contradiction. This leads to discomfort, dissatisfaction, and a significant loss of trust. That's almost inevitable. The common resolution for this kind of organizational dissonance is typically to change the behavior, implement new policies, ensure stricter adherence to those ethical standards, try to realign things. We also observe this in politics all the time. Many parties publicly condemn corruption, yet they readily engage with or form alliances with corrupt parties and candidates if it helps them secure votes and win elections. Their actions effectively contradict their stated beliefs, creating dissonance for observers and, you'd have to assume, for themselves too on some level.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I think. How do these internal psychological mechanisms, like dissonance, play out on a much grander societal scale, particularly in the realm of politics? Let's talk about political attitudes.
Sure. Political attitudes refer to that whole complex web of views, opinions, and feelings individuals hold about political issues, policies, events, parties, leaders. Everything political, really. They truly encompass the beliefs and preferences that fundamentally shape how people think about and engage with politics. And these attitudes have many dimensions. It's not just one thing. From broad ideological beliefs like liberalism or conservatism to very specific policy preferences on things like healthcare or taxation. They include our party identification, our opinions on specific political leaders, our core political values like equality or freedom or justice, and even our attitudes toward participating in the political process itself, whether it's voting or protesting or something else.
And often, these attitudes are deeply shaped by political ideologies, aren't they? These aren't just random thoughts. They're more like comprehensive sets of ideals. They offer a political blueprint, outlining both the ends, how society should work, and the means, the appropriate ways to achieve those ends. For example, nationalism. This ideology posits the nation as the fundamental unit of social life, prioritizing its interests above others. Our sources mention how, after Turkey voiced support for Pakistan against India, some Indian companies ceased trade with Turkey. That reflects a nationalist stance. Similarly, China banning critical mineral exports despite global demand clearly reflects a nationalist approach, prioritizing its own strategic interests. Then you have political conservatism, which generally favors tradition, established institutions, and more gradual change. And liberalism, which tends to champion individual liberty, freedom of thought, limited government, and free exchange of ideas.
And social media, for instance, it has emerged as a truly massive influencer of political attitudes. You can't ignore it, particularly in recent elections like the 2024 example, where it was heavily used to mobilize support through various ideologies, including nationalism. You can see these sometimes quite rigid attitudes playing out on the global stage, too. Like the example of the U.S.'s persistent efforts to influence India regarding the Chabahar port deal. That reflects a firm, almost unyielding diplomatic approach rooted in certain attitudes. Ultimately, though, political attitudes are influenced by a vast array of factors. Our family and upbringing, definitely. Education, socioeconomic status, where we live, geography, religion. Media consumption, huge one there. Gender, race, and ethnicity, major historical events that shape generations, and of course, deeply personal experiences that mold our worldview. It's complex.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Mahatma Gandhi had a profound and I think very challenging philosophy on politics. He firmly believed politics must be rooted in morality, ethics, honesty, nonviolence, and justice. That was non-negotiable for him. For him, the means were just as important as the ends. Achieving political goals through immoral or violent means was simply unacceptable.
Absolutely. Gandhi famously asserted that the human mind or society is not divided into watertight compartments called social, political, and religious. All act and react upon one another. He continued, quote, "For me, politics bereft of religion are absolute dirt, ever to be shunned." Strong words. He went even further, stating, "Truth has drawn me into the field of politics, and I can say without the slightest hesitation that those who say that religion has nothing to do with politics do not know what religion means." He saw an intrinsic link.
This raises an important, maybe age-old question that many grapple with. It's often said that politics and ethics simply don't mix, that they're like oil and water. Our sources provide arguments on both sides of this. On one hand, you have the Machiavellian perspective, the end justifies the means, or chilling historical examples like Hitler's actions, or scandals like Watergate, which seem to suggest politics is just a brutal game with no real space for ethics.
But on the other hand, figures like Mahatma Gandhi directly counter this, forcefully. He explicitly listed politics without principle as one of his 7 sins. Dr. Kalam's entirely ethical political career offers another powerful, more modern example cited in the sources. Even policy decisions like sin taxes on goods like tobacco, designed to discourage harmful behavior, or demonetization efforts aimed at combating corruption, these demonstrate an attempt at ethical grounding into political action. The strong conclusion from our sources is that ethical behavior isn't just nice to have. It can profoundly enhance the legitimacy and long-term effectiveness of political institutions. When leaders act ethically, they build trust, and trust is really the bedrock of stable governance.
Okay, moving beyond just political systems, we also have moral attitudes. Dietrich von Hildebrand explore these deeply. These are the feelings, beliefs, and perspectives that truly guide our understanding of right and wrong, shaping how we judge actions and make our daily choices. He highlighted several key types of moral attitudes.
That's right. First, he talked about reverence. This is a deep respect that involves the humbling of the self, an awe almost. Our sources give the example of the nationwide reverence shown when Virat Kohli retired from Test cricket, a collective admiration for his achievement and dedication. Then there's faithfulness, meaning unfailingly remaining loyal and persevering, especially when things get tough. Awareness of responsibility is about consciously considering the consequences of our decisions. This is crucial for anyone in a position of power. Like the Chief Justice of India's recent statement cited, emphasizing judges' responsibility to deliver judgments that are actually understandable to the people affected. Veracity is essentially truthfulness and moral character. Think of it as simply being honest and reliable in your words and actions. It's how you build trust with others. Conversely, the sources cite Trump's extensively documented dishonest statements as profoundly lowering public credibility. It shows the impact of lacking veracity. And finally, goodness. This is the inclination to do what is right and beneficial, encompassing compassion, integrity, and a desire to be fair, kind, and just. For instance, a young civil servant having deep reverence for an honest senior can inspire faithfulness and veracity in their own career path. That positive modeling. On the flip side, the recent unearthing of, 6 lakh fake pollution trading certificates, that reveals a stark and shocking lack of these essential moral attitudes, a real breakdown.
This raises a truly thought-provoking question, maybe a bit of a philosophical one. The ancient Tamil text, the Tirukkural, states, "Falsehood takes the place of truth when it results in unblemished common good." What does this profound quotation mean to you, especially in our complex modern world? Can falsehood ever really replace truth?
That quote really plunges us into a deep ethical dilemma, doesn't it? Can a lie ever be justified for a greater good without causing any harm? That unblemished part is key. Our sources acknowledge that, in very specific, perhaps rare instances, this can appear true. For example, in the Mahabharata, Krishna urged Yudhishthira to utter a partial falsehood, a carefully worded statement, for a greater strategic good in the war. Or consider disaster management mock drills. For maximum readiness, the disaster is initially presented as real to participants. The intention is good, to foster preparedness and ultimately save lives. However, the critical caveat is unblemished common good. When does falsehood not replace truth, even if the intentions seem positive? Well, if the means themselves are unethical or illegal, like granting fake environmental impact assessment approvals that lead to a building collapsing years later. The initial shortcut caused immense harm, or something like extrajudicial killings. The end might seem desirable to some, but the means are deeply unethical and damage the rule of law. So the initial falsehood or shortcut deeply erodes the ethical framework of an organization or a society. It sets dangerous precedents and almost inevitably leads to unforeseen negative consequences down the line. So while truth might be temporarily obscured or even compromised for what seems like a beneficial outcome, our sources conclude that it can never be truly replaced by falsehood. Truthfulness, at its core, is a universal foundational value. If you compromise it, it has a way of unraveling everything else.
Right. Okay, so what does this all mean when we zoom out a bit? How do these individual attitudes, these personal moral frameworks, interact with the broader social world around us? This leads us straight into the subtle but incredibly powerful forces of social influence and persuasion.
Exactly. Social influence refers to the myriad ways individuals and groups affect the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors of others. This can be conscious or completely unconscious. It happens constantly through things like advertising, peer pressure, mass media, even subtle social cues we pick up on without realizing it. Herbert Kelman identified 3 distinct types of social influence. First, there's compliance. This is where people publicly agree or go along with something, but privately they might still dissent. They don't really buy into it. Think about complying with a new government rule that you personally don't agree with, but you do it anyway. Then there's identification. Here, you're influenced by someone you like and respect, or perhaps someone you aspire to be like. A role model, maybe. Our sources mention the powerful influence of figures like Ramdev. In that Patanjali misleading advertisements case, people identified with his persona and trusted the products. Or simply identifying with a celebrity endorsement of a particular lifestyle choice or product. Finally, internalization. This is when you accept a belief or behavior both publicly and privately. You truly believe it to be right or necessary. This could be accepting a new rule as genuinely beneficial for society. Or think about the almost magnetic pull that draws people into those long queues for a new iPhone model that might be driven by a deeper, internalized desire for materialism or status. Or even how a leader's visit to a troubled area can instill widespread trust and counter disinformation because people internalize that message of reassurance.
It's fascinating how different motivations drive those different actions. Compliance versus internalization. Very different. Gerard also described 2 fundamental psychological needs that lead humans to conform, that need to fit in. One is the informational social influence, the deep-seated need to be right. We want to understand the world correctly. So we look to others for information, accepting their views as evidence of reality, and this often leads to private acceptance. We genuinely change our minds. The other is normative social influence, the need to be liked, to be accepted by the group. Here we conform to the positive expectations of others, which usually leads just to public compliance. We go along to get along, basically. And there's so many factors that can amplify social influence, right? Things like charisma, a person's reputation or perceived expertise, who the messenger is, what incentives are offered. Also the prevailing norms of a group, what everyone else is doing, what feels salient or relevant in the moment. Even subtle subconscious priming, emotional associations, what the sources call affect, and our own ego acting in ways that make us feel better about ourselves. Malcolm Gladwell even gave us that model for how new ideas transmit through society, the innovators, early adopters, early and late majorities, and finally the laggards, that whole curve.
Right. And building on that, persuasion is a more conscious, deliberate form of social influence. It's not accidental. It's actively guiding people toward an idea, attitude, or action, typically through rational means and, crucially, through free choice. That element of choice is important. Think of it as a problem-solving strategy that relies on appeals logical, emotional, not force or coercion. The key elements are that it uses symbolic means, verbal or nonverbal communication. It's a deliberate attempt to influence. It allows for free choice, so not brainwashing or manipulation in the extreme sense. And ideally, it's meant to benefit all parties involved. Though that ideal isn't always met.
Exactly. We see it everywhere. Advertising urging us to buy a product, a political candidate trying to sway voters. It's constant. Our sources highlight how modern persuasion can be incredibly subtle, sometimes even insidious, like algorithm-driven social media polarization, where people are targeted and influenced, maybe radicalized, without even realizing they're being persuaded. It just feels like the information they naturally encounter. Even in global relations, you see persuasive diplomacy. The example given is India's external affairs minister urging Russia-Ukraine talks. That's a powerful form of persuasion on the world stage. Professor Perloff outlines that modern persuasion differs significantly from the past in 5 major ways. He argues there are just more messages than ever before. They travel much faster. Persuasion is a huge business now. It's often far more subtle. And it's infinitely more complex because of digital networks and data.
And how attitudes change through persuasion is a complex interplay. It's influenced by characteristics of the target person, their intelligence, self-esteem, even their mood at the time. Also, characteristics of the source of the message, things like their perceived expertise, trustworthiness, or even attractiveness can make a difference. And the message itself matters, for example, whether it presents only one side or acknowledges and refutes counter-arguments. Robert Cialdini famously outlined his weapons of influence, which are essentially psychological shortcuts our brains use. These are powerful tools for persuasion. They include reciprocation, that feeling of obligation to return a favor. Social proof, looking to see what others are doing, especially when uncertain. Authority, deferring to experts or figures of authority, like subordinates following a manager who leads by example, that's cited. Scarcity, valuing things that are rare or seem to be running out. Liking, being more easily swayed by people we like. And commitment and consistency, feeling compelled to follow through on things we've previously agreed to or stated publicly. We want to appear consistent. Other psychological theories also contribute to our understanding. Things like amplification, where expressing certainty actually hardens attitudes. Or the sleeper effect, where messages from low credibility sources can surprisingly gain persuasive power over time as we forget the source but remember the message. A great real-world example mentioned is Indoor's Jal Ganga Samvedhan Abhiyan, a water conservation campaign. It successfully used a mix of emotional appeals, logical data about water scarcity, and visible ethical leadership to galvanize widespread community efforts. A really positive case study.
But what about resisting these persuasive messages? Because, as you said, we're bombarded by them constantly. How do we push back? Our sources suggest a few key techniques. There's attitude inoculation. This is interesting. It's like giving yourself a vaccine against persuasion. You're exposed to small, weakened doses of counter-arguments before you face a strong persuasive attack. This builds up your mental defenses, your resistance. Then there's attitude forewarning. Simply being warned in advance that someone is about to try and change your attitude can make a big difference. It prompts you to analyze the message much more carefully and critically, rather than just accepting it passively. And finally, reactance theory. This suggests that strong prohibitions can sometimes backfire. They can actually increase liking for forbidden activities. Why? Because people resist perceived threats to their freedom of choice. Tell someone they can't do something and suddenly they might want to do it more.
Absolutely. And what's truly fascinating here, and critically important, is the whole idea of ethical persuasion. With all these powerful techniques and the widespread influence possible today, the ethical dimension becomes paramount. We need guidelines. Our sources introduce the Terrace test, which outlines 5 key principles or prima facie duties for ethical persuasion. T is for truthfulness of the message. A is for authenticity of the persuader. Are they genuine? R is for respect for the persuadee, treating them as ends, not means. E is for equity of the persuasive appeal. Is it fair, especially to vulnerable audiences? And S is for social responsibility. Does it consider the common good? If all 5 principles are respected, the communication is generally deemed ethical. This stands in sharp contrast to, for example, the widespread hate speech we've unfortunately seen in recent elections, which clearly violates multiple Paris principles. Public servants, too, have a framework for ethical communication mentioned. It emphasizes respect for reason, truthfulness, respect for the audience, and authenticity in their language. It's about building trust through honest communication, not just manipulating to get compliance.
Okay, so what does this all mean when we bring it all together? When we try to understand some of society's most significant and persistent challenges? Let's talk about prejudice, discrimination, and stereotypes. These seem to involve attitudes, influence, and behavior all wrapped up together.
Definitely. Prejudice refers to irrational attitudes and opinions held by one group about another. These are often deeply preconceived beliefs, and they can be positive or negative, though we usually focus on the negative ones. It's sometimes linked to low self-esteem tragically. Hating certain groups can sometimes enhance a person's own shaky sense of self-worth. Crucially, prejudice involves all 3 components of an attitude: thoughts, beliefs, feelings, emotions, and behavioral intentions, how one intends to act. Discrimination, on the other hand, refers specifically to discriminatory behaviors, the actions directed against another group. Negative prejudice often leads to discrimination, which might be used consciously or unconsciously to protect opportunities for one's own group by denying access to others. Discrimination, notably, involves only behavior. It's the acting out of prejudice.
And these harmful attitudes and behaviors often spring from several deep-seated sources, don't they? They can be passed down culturally from society, maybe perpetuated by parents, or through insidious media stereotypes that we absorb without realizing it. They can come from conforming behaviors that intense pressure to align with the prejudiced views of family or friends to fit in. Sometimes they stem from what psychologists call an authoritarian personality type, or from simple ethnocentrism, the belief that one's own culture is inherently superior. In India, for instance, the sources mention pervasive prejudices like questioning women working outside the home, or practices like women eating separately from men in some households. Still happening. There's a recent example cited of a Dubai-based CEO whose public plea was, frankly, riddled with deep-seated prejudices against Indian students. It caused quite a stir. But we also see positive steps. The Supreme Court stepping in to help a woman sarpanch fight gender prejudice in her village, or Tata Steel operationalizing an all-woman shift in a traditionally male domain. That's a significant move towards equity, challenging old prejudices.
Then there are stereotypes. These are essentially oversimplified beliefs or generalizations about a category of people. All X are Y. They are incredibly pervasive, often seem to develop naturally as a sort of mental shortcut, and they make us highly susceptible to their effects, often without us even noticing. Belinda Jones identified 4 key origins, ways these stereotypes form and stick. One is just the way our brains naturally categorize information to make sense of the world quickly. Another is the things we consistently hear from others. Repetition makes things seem true. Also, how we selectively remember information that confirms our existing biases. We notice the exceptions less. And finally, the quick inferences we make based on very limited information or single encounters. Foreigners, for instance, might hold outdated stereotypes about Indians. The sources mention land of snake charmers or perceptions of dirt and chaos, things like that. Within India, unfortunately, stereotypes abound. Across gender, region, like negative perceptions of certain states as backward, caste, class, race, color, and even cultural practices. They are everywhere.
So, what can be done? Our sources offer several classic solutions to combat prejudice and discrimination. There's the self-esteem hypothesis, which suggests that education in fostering higher, healthier self-esteem can actually reduce prejudice. People who feel good about themselves may have less need to denigrate others. Then the contact hypothesis. This is a hopeful idea, that bringing different groups together, especially into conditions of equality and cooperation, can help them appreciate common backgrounds and reduce hostility. Just getting to know people. The cooperation hypothesis takes this a step further when conflicting groups have to cooperate to achieve common superordinate goals they both care about. Prejudice can decrease. And finally, the legal hypothesis. Using the force of law to prohibit discrimination, compelling behavioral change even if attitudes lag behind.
But this raises an important question about these solutions, doesn't it? Our sources note that while individual-level changes are important, they haven't always been broadly successful on their own in eradicating deep-seated societal prejudice. And while laws are absolutely essential, they curb overt discrimination and provide recourse, they don't necessarily guarantee deep, long-term attitude or behavior change on their own. People might comply outwardly but still hold prejudiced views. To truly break down stereotypes and prejudice, the sources suggest a multi-pronged approach. We need to keep an open mind, actively work on changing our own ingrained attitudes and beliefs, and crucially, leaders must lead from the front. Setting powerful examples makes a huge difference, which, as we've discussed, powerfully brings in social influence and ethical persuasion, using their platform for good. We also need to actively propagate positive values across society and focus heavily on value education for children right from the start. Thoughtful parenting matters enormously. Fostering a truly positive, inclusive societal mindset is the long-term goal.
A truly powerful, real-world application of all these concepts, attitudes, social influence, prejudice, persuasion, breaking down barriers, comes from that case study of the Dolly cook in a village primary school. Remember, parents, due to deep-seated caste prejudice, pulled their children out, threatening the vital midday meal scheme. A really challenging situation. The village head, the sarpanch, implemented a really smart, multifaceted strategy to overcome this. It wasn't just one thing. First, they focused on deeply understanding the problem, the root causes of the prejudice, not just reacting. Then they set out to persuade parents, not by lecturing, but by focusing on what parents cared about the child's education, the quality and hygiene of the food itself, framing it as separate from the cook's caste. They even offer private counseling. They organized parent-teacher meetings to create dialogue. They enlisted respected villagers, people with social influence, to help sway opinions. And most powerfully, perhaps, they led by example. The sarpanch and other local leaders publicly ate the food prepared by the cook, alongside the villagers, demonstrating acceptance and breaking the taboo. As a last resort, legal action against discrimination was kept as an option. But the real emphasis was on community change, on changing hearts and minds.
Exactly. And this case beautifully highlights the crucial role of every segment of society working together. It wasn't just the Sarpanch. Teachers, for instance, held regular meetings with parents, but they also visibly ate with the children, demonstrating acceptance and normalizing the situation. Parents were encouraged to get positively involved, to join school management committees that included representatives from all castes, breaking down old barriers. They even participated in peer group meetings to directly address and reduce prejudices amongst themselves. And the Sarpanch and the local administration worked to create a peaceful environment, actively promoted cooperation between groups, and consistently raised awareness, expertly utilizing emotional intelligence, social influence, and those ethical persuasion skills we talked about. The involvement of all sections from the ground up is absolutely necessary for sustainable results. You can't impose change from the top down entirely. This really echoes the wisdom of historical figures and movements mentioned in the sources like Sikhism's Langar, Dr. Ambedkar's lifelong fight against caste, and the Bhakti movement saints, all of whom preached powerfully against caste discrimination, showing that deep-seated prejudice can indeed be overcome through collective effort and strong moral conviction.
Okay, finally, let's transition to a very modern ethical dilemma, one where our attitudes and values are constantly being challenged, pushing the very boundaries of what we understand about life itself. Let's talk briefly about biotechnology. This technology, which utilizes biological systems, living organisms, or their parts to develop products, it's brought massive help to humankind, no doubt. But it also comes with some significant and really complex ethical concerns that we're still grappling with.
Indeed. It's a double-edged sword in many ways. Our sources outline several pressing ethical issues. There's the critical need to protect human subjects in clinical trials, ensuring their safety, privacy, confidentiality, and genuine informed consent. That's fundamental. There are profound affordability and accessibility issues. Will biotech breakthroughs only benefit the wealthy, creating an even wider health divide? That's a major justice concern. We also see instances of potential moral corruption, like misleading claims and greed from practitioners selling unproven or risky treatments, like some early stem cell therapies. And perhaps most terrifyingly, there's the potential for the misuse of biotechnology to create biological weapons, a catastrophic risk. Looking slightly further ahead, the possibility of gene editing to create designer babies raises huge ethical questions considered by many to be playing God, or fundamentally altering human nature in unpredictable ways. And we mustn't forget the environmental threats, potentially from genetically modified organisms, GMOs, like the example of Bt cotton and its ecological impacts. All of these challenges bring us into direct conflict with core ethical principles we hold dear. Autonomy, beneficence, doing good, non-maleficence, doing no harm, informed consent, animal rights, justice, and fundamental human dignity.
So, with such profound implications, how do we navigate these incredibly complex ethical dilemmas in biotechnology? What are the guideposts?
The best practices, according to our sources, really revolve around strict adherence to bioethics principles. Bioethics is the dedicated field studying these very ethical issues in biology and medicine. We need experts focused on this. The scientific community must uphold the highest standards of biosafety and probity, meaning integrity and honesty, ensuring research is conducted with extreme caution and transparency. Crucially, we must constantly recall Gandhi's timeless warning, cited again here: science without humanity is a sin. Because without a strong ethical compass, without a deep concern for humanity and potential consequences, science, no matter how advanced or powerful, can indeed cause great harm. The power requires responsibility. And finally, we need to adopt sophisticated risk management approaches, like the risk-benefit approach mentioned, where we rigorously weigh the probability and severity of potential harm against the potential benefit, trying to ensure that progress truly serves human well-being in a just and equitable way.
Wow. We have covered so much ground today. Really an intense deep dive. From that intricate dance between our attitudes and behaviors to the mental gymnastics of cognitive dissonance when things don't align. We then zoomed out to understand how political and moral attitudes shape our societies, both subtly and overtly, for better or worse. We explored the powerful, often invisible forces of social influence and persuasion that are constantly at play around us, shaping our choices every day, and confronted the deep-seated societal challenges of prejudice, discrimination, and stereotypes, even seeing how a community with leadership and collective effort can come together to overcome them. That was hopeful. And finally, we just touched on the complex ethical frontiers of biotechnology, where our values are constantly being tested by rapid scientific advancement. So as you listen to this, what stands out to you from this deep dive? Think about how these concepts, whether it's the subtle power of persuasion you see online, Or maybe that uncomfortable feeling of cognitive dissonance you've experienced yourself, or the profound challenge of overcoming ingrained prejudices in your own community. Think about how they're at play in your own daily interactions. How can understanding them help you navigate information with a clearer mind, maybe make more conscious choices, or perhaps even inspire you to foster positive change, however small, in your community? Keep exploring these complex, fascinating dynamics. There's always more to learn about what makes us human.